At 2 in the morning, an orange tabby cat Dr. Rebecca Chen had never seen before was clawing frantically at her door, yowling with such desperate urgency that she knew something was dying. When the cat bolted down her driveway and looked back with those piercing green eyes, Rebecca grabbed her flashlight and followed it into the darkness, having no idea she was about to deliver 4 bobcat kittens in a dirt den 2 miles deep in the forest, while their wild mother bled out from a birth gone catastrophically wrong. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The October moon hung low over the quiet streets of Redwood Valley, California, casting silver shadows through the towering pines that gave the small mountain town its name. Most residents had long since retired for the evening, their homes dark except for the occasional porch light left burning as a courtesy to late-night travelers. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from dying fires and the earthy smell of fallen leaves that carpeted the winding roads. It was the kind of peaceful midnight that made people grateful they had chosen to live away from the chaos of the cities, where nature still held sway and the rhythm of life moved slower, more deliberately. But on this particular night, that peace was about to be shattered by an act of desperation so extraordinary that it would challenge everything the local veterinarian thought she knew about the boundaries between wild and domestic animals. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been a veterinarian for 15 years, the last 8 of which she had spent running the Redwood Valley Animal Clinic from her property on the edge of town. At 42, she had seen just about everything that could go wrong with domestic animals, from the routine vaccinations and dental cleanings to the emergency surgeries that came with late-night phone calls. Her clinic, a converted barn attached to her 2-story farmhouse, had become a fixture in the community, known for Rebecca's compassionate care and her willingness to work with families who struggled to afford treatment for their beloved pets. She lived alone except for her 3 rescue cats and an aging golden retriever named Copper, having divorced 5 years earlier when her ex-husband decided small-town life wasn't for him. Rebecca had never regretted staying. This place, with its tight-knit community and proximity to wilderness, felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. The house was dark when the commotion started. Rebecca had gone to bed early after a particularly long day that had included 2 surgeries, a difficult diagnosis, and the heartbreaking task of helping an elderly couple say goodbye to their dog of 14 years. She had fallen into a deep sleep, the kind that comes from physical and emotional exhaustion, and might have stayed that way until morning, if not for the sound that pierced through her dreams. At first, she thought it was Copper, perhaps having a nightmare or needing to go outside. But as consciousness slowly returned, she realized the sound was coming from outside her bedroom window, and it wasn't canine at all. It was a desperate, urgent yowling that seemed to carry both fear and determination in equal measure. Rebecca sat up in bed, momentarily disoriented in the darkness. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 2:17 in the morning. Copper lifted his graying muzzle from where he lay on his dog bed in the corner, a low whine escaping his throat. The yowling continued, growing more frantic, and now Rebecca could hear another sound beneath it, a rhythmic thumping against her front door. Someone's cat was in distress, that much was clear, but something about the urgency of the sound made her heart rate quicken. In all her years of practice, she had learned to distinguish between different types of animal distress calls, and this one set off every alarm bell in her professional instincts. She threw back her covers and grabbed the robe from the hook on her bedroom door, not bothering with slippers as she hurried down the stairs. Copper followed more slowly, his arthritis making the descent cautious. The yowling hadn't stopped, and now she could hear the distinct sound of claws scraping against wood. Whatever was at her door was desperate to get her attention. Rebecca flipped on the porch light as she approached the front door, peering through the window beside it to see what awaited her outside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. An orange tabby cat, its coat dusty and matted, stood on its hind legs pawing frantically at her door. But it wasn't the cat's appearance that stopped Rebecca cold. It was the way the animal looked directly at her through the window, its green eyes wide and urgent, and then turned and ran several steps down her driveway before stopping and looking back. The behavior was so deliberate, so clearly communicative, that Rebecca found herself reaching for the doorknob before her rational mind could catch up with her actions. She had heard stories of animals leading humans to help injured companions or lost young ones, but she had always filed such tales in the category of heartwarming folklore rather than documented reality. Yet here was a cat, a domestic orange tabby, exhibiting precisely that kind of behavior at 2 a.m. on her doorstep. Rebecca opened the door cautiously, not wanting to startle the cat or let Copper out without knowing what the situation was. The moment the door cracked open, the tabby let out another urgent yowl and took off running down the driveway, stopping after about 20 feet to look back at her. The message could not have been clearer. "Come with me. Something is wrong." Rebecca's mind raced through possibilities as she quickly pulled on the boots she kept by the door and grabbed a flashlight from the hall table. Her first thought was that the cat's owner must be in trouble, perhaps injured or having a medical emergency. But something told her the truth was going to be far more unusual than that. She called back to Copper to stay, knowing the old dog couldn't keep pace if she needed to move quickly, and stepped out into the night. The air was colder than she had expected, her breath misting in front of her face as she hurried after the tabby. The cat waited for her to catch up, then immediately started trotting down the driveway toward the road, frequently looking back to ensure she was following. Rebecca had grabbed her cell phone but realized with frustration that she had forgotten to charge it. The battery indicator showed only 5% remaining. Still, she kept moving, her curiosity and concern now fully engaged. The tabby led her onto Mountain View Road, the main street that ran through her section of town. The houses here were spread far apart, sitting on large parcels of land that gave residents privacy and space. Streetlights were few and far between, making Rebecca grateful for her flashlight as she followed the orange cat through pools of shadow and moonlight. The tabby moved with purpose, occasionally breaking into a run when Rebecca fell too far behind, its tail held high like a flag guiding her forward. They passed the Morrison place, dark and quiet, then the empty lot where Old Man Henderson had once planned to build before his health failed. Rebecca's medical training had taught her to stay calm in emergencies, but her mind was spinning with questions as she jogged after the cat. Whose cat was this? She thought she knew most of the animals in the area, but this tabby wasn't familiar. Why had it come specifically to her house when there were at least 3 other homes closer to wherever they were heading? And most pressingly, what exactly was she being led toward? The cat showed no signs of stopping or slowing, maintaining a pace that had Rebecca's heart pounding and her breath coming faster. She was in decent shape from hiking the local trails, but following a determined feline through the night was testing her endurance. They had covered what Rebecca estimated was about a mile when the tabby suddenly veered off the road onto a narrow dirt path that led into a densely wooded area. This was the edge of the national forest land that bordered the town, hundreds of acres of wilderness that locals used for hiking and hunting, but that remained largely untouched by development. Rebecca hesitated for just a moment at the entrance to the path, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness between the trees. Going into the forest at night without telling anyone where she was going violated every safety rule she knew. But the tabby had stopped and was looking back at her with those urgent green eyes, and Rebecca found herself unable to turn away. She pulled out her phone and quickly sent a text to her closest neighbor, a retired forest ranger named Tom Bradshaw, knowing he was an early riser who would see it within a few hours. Following orange tabby cat into forest off Mountain View Road near Henderson Lot. Not sure what emergency, but animal seems to be leading me somewhere. If you don't hear from me by 7 a.m., please send help. She hit send and hoped her phone's last bit of battery would last long enough to transmit the message. Then she plunged into the forest after the cat. The path was rough and overgrown, clearly not maintained for regular foot traffic. Branches caught at Rebecca's robe and roots threatened to trip her in the darkness. The tabby navigated the terrain with feline grace, moving swiftly through the underbrush while Rebecca crashed along behind like a comparative elephant. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly as she struggled to keep pace, illuminating brief snapshots of moss-covered rocks, twisted tree roots, and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting back at her from the darkness as some small nocturnal creature watched their passage. The sounds of the night forest surrounded her, crickets and frogs creating a symphony that would have been soothing under other circumstances, but now seemed vaguely ominous. They had been walking for what Rebecca guessed was another 10 minutes, though time seemed to have lost its normal meaning in the dark forest when the tabby's behavior suddenly changed. The cat slowed, its body language shifting from urgent purposefulness to cautious wariness. It began moving more carefully, placing each paw deliberately and frequently pausing to look and listen. Rebecca slowed as well, her senses heightening as she tried to understand what had changed. Then she heard it, a low, pained sound that sent chills down her spine. It was coming from somewhere ahead, just beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. The tabby looked back at Rebecca one more time, as if to say, "This is it. This is what I brought you for," then carefully approached a dark opening in a tumble of boulders that formed a natural shelter. Rebecca moved closer, directing her flashlight toward the opening, and what she saw made her gasp. Inside the rocky den, lying on a bed of leaves and pine needles, was a bobcat. The wild feline's spotted coat was matted and damp, and even from several feet away, Rebecca could see the animal was in severe distress. The bobcat's sides were heaving with labored breathing, and as Rebecca's light fully illuminated the den, she realized with shock that the animal was heavily pregnant and clearly in the midst of a difficult labor. Rebecca's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing. The orange tabby moved into the den without hesitation, approaching the struggling bobcat and gently touching its nose to the wild cat's face, in what could only be described as a gesture of comfort. The bobcat, which by all rights should have been aggressive even in its weakened state, made no move to threaten the domestic cat. Instead, the wild feline's yellow eyes found Rebecca's, and in them she saw something that transcended species boundaries, a desperate plea for help that any mother in distress might make. This was beyond anything in Rebecca's experience, beyond any training or textbook scenario she had encountered in her years of veterinary practice. A domestic cat had somehow formed a bond with a wild bobcat, strong enough to lead a human through nearly 2 miles of darkness to help with a birth emergency. Rebecca's professional instincts kicked in despite her shock. She quickly assessed the situation from where she stood, not wanting to get too close and risk being attacked by a frightened wild animal. The bobcat was clearly exhausted, its breathing rapid and shallow. She could see the telltale signs of prolonged labor, the distended abdomen, the wetness around the hindquarters, and most concerning, the lack of any visible progress. In her years treating pregnant cats, Rebecca had dealt with dystocia, the medical term for difficult birth, many times. It was a life-threatening emergency that required immediate intervention, and this bobcat was clearly suffering from it. Without help, both the mother and her unborn kittens would die, possibly within the next few hours. The orange tabby came back to Rebecca and rubbed against her legs, then returned to the bobcat, the message clear: "You need to help her." Rebecca took a deep breath, weighing her options. She had no equipment, no surgical tools, no anesthesia or medications. Her clinic was a 20-minute drive away even in good conditions, and there was no way she could transport a wild bobcat in distress without specialized equipment and help. Calling for assistance would take time she suspected they didn't have, and even if she could get animal control or a wildlife specialist here, what could they do that she couldn't? The truth was harsh and simple. If she wanted to save this animal, she was going to have to do it here now with nothing but her knowledge and her hands. She pulled out her phone to check for service and swore softly when she saw the screen was dark. The battery had finally died. There would be no calling for backup, no looking up emergency protocols, no safety net. It was just her, 2 cats, and the forest night. Rebecca had always believed that veterinary medicine was as much about instinct and improvisation as it was about following protocols, and now that belief was going to be tested in ways she had never imagined. She thought of her mentor during her residency, Dr. Patricia Holloway, who had once told her that the mark of a truly great veterinarian wasn't following the textbook in ideal conditions, but knowing when to trust your training and take calculated risks in impossible situations. Rebecca moved slowly closer to the den, speaking in soft, soothing tones. "Easy, girl, I'm here to help. I know you're scared, but we're going to get through this together." The bobcat's ears flattened slightly, a sign of wariness, but the animal made no move to flee or attack. Perhaps it understood that Rebecca was its only chance, or perhaps it was simply too exhausted to mount any defense. The orange tabby positioned itself near the bobcat's head, continuing to offer what comfort it could, occasionally licking the wildcat's ears in a gesture that seemed to calm the distressed mother. As Rebecca knelt at the entrance to the den, she could now see more details in the beam of her flashlight. The bobcat was young, probably only 2 or 3 years old, and this was likely her first litter. First pregnancies were always more prone to complications, and wild animals didn't have the advantage of prenatal care to identify potential problems before they became life-threatening. Rebecca could see that the bobcat had been trying to deliver for some time. The bedding was soaked, and there were signs of blood loss that worried her. She needed to examine the animal to understand what was preventing the birth, but touching a wild bobcat, even one in distress, was incredibly dangerous. Rebecca took off her robe and slowly, carefully draped it over her arm to provide some protection. Then she spoke again to the bobcat, her voice steady and calm despite her racing heart. "I'm going to touch you now. I need to see what's happening. Please don't bite me because I really want to help you and your babies." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her, having a conversation with a wild animal as if it could understand her intentions. But somehow it felt important to maintain that connection, to project confidence and compassion even in the face of fear. She reached out slowly and placed her protected hand on the bobcat's flank. The animal flinched but didn't strike out. Rebecca could feel the contractions rippling through the bobcat's body, strong and regular, which meant the mother still had strength left. That was good. What wasn't good was what Rebecca discovered when she carefully examined the birth canal. She could feel the presenting kitten, but it was positioned wrong. One of its legs bent back in a way that was preventing passage through the pelvic opening. This was a breech presentation complicated by limb malposition, and without intervention, the kitten would never be born. It was likely already dead from prolonged labor, but there might still be others behind it that could be saved if Rebecca could resolve the obstruction. The procedure Rebecca needed to perform was called obstetric manipulation, and under normal circumstances it would be done in a sterile surgical suite with the patient under anesthesia and a full medical team standing by. Rebecca would be doing it in a dirt den in the middle of a dark forest with nothing but a flashlight and her bare hands. She had no choice but to try. The alternative was to watch this young mother and her entire litter die, and that wasn't something Rebecca could accept, not when she had the knowledge and skill to possibly make a difference. She positioned herself as comfortably as she could and explained to the bobcat what she was about to do, knowing the animal couldn't understand her words but hoping her tone would convey her intent. "I'm going to reach inside and try to reposition the kitten. It's going to be uncomfortable, but I'll be as gentle as I can." The orange tabby seemed to sense the critical moment had arrived and pressed closer to the bobcat's head, purring loudly in what Rebecca interpreted as encouragement. Then Rebecca began the delicate, dangerous work of trying to save lives in the most unlikely of operating rooms. Her hands worked carefully, feeling for the malpositioned limb. The bobcat groaned and shifted but still didn't attack, which Rebecca took as either remarkable trust or complete exhaustion, possibly both. She located the bent leg and began the painstaking process of trying to reposition it, working between contractions when the muscles weren't clamped down quite as tightly. It was slow, difficult work that required both strength and delicacy. Too much force could tear delicate tissues or harm the kitten, but too little would accomplish nothing. Sweat beaded on Rebecca's forehead despite the cool night air as she focused every bit of her concentration on the task. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Rebecca worked, her world narrowing to just the feel of tiny bones and soft tissue beneath her fingers. The orange tabby maintained its vigil, occasionally meowing softly as if offering encouragement. The bobcat's breathing had become more labored, and Rebecca knew time was running out. The mother's strength was fading, and once she stopped having effective contractions, the situation would become even more dire. Rebecca's arms ached from the awkward position and the sustained effort, but she kept working, kept trying to manipulate that stubborn limb into the correct position for delivery. Then, suddenly, she felt it give. The leg straightened, sliding into proper alignment, and the kitten's body shifted. Rebecca withdrew her hands carefully and waited, watching as the bobcat's body took over. A strong contraction rippled through the mother's abdomen, and this time there was progress. Rebecca could see the kitten beginning to emerge, still enclosed in its membranous sac. "Come on, Mama, you can do this," Rebecca whispered. "One more good push and you'll have your first baby." The bobcat seemed to gather her remaining strength and pushed hard, and suddenly the kitten was born, sliding out onto the bed of leaves in a rush of fluid. Rebecca's training kicked in immediately. The kitten wasn't moving, and she could see it was still enclosed in the amniotic sac. In a normal birth, the mother would immediately tear away the membrane and begin vigorously licking the kitten to stimulate breathing. But this exhausted bobcat barely had the strength to lift her head. The orange tabby seemed to understand the urgency and began pawing at the sac, trying to help. But its claws weren't making enough progress. Rebecca knew she had only moments to act before the kitten would suffocate or suffer brain damage from lack of oxygen. She reached forward quickly and tore open the membrane with her fingers, clearing it away from the tiny kitten's face. The baby was perfectly formed, covered in wet, matted fur with a distinctive spotted pattern just beginning to show through. But it wasn't breathing. Rebecca's mind flashed through her neonatal resuscitation training as she gently picked up the kitten, which was about the size of her palm. She cleared the fluid from its mouth and nose with her fingers, then began rubbing its small body vigorously with her robe to stimulate circulation and breathing. Nothing happened. The kitten remained limp and unresponsive. Rebecca refused to give up. She had come too far, worked too hard to lose this baby now. She positioned the kitten carefully and placed her mouth over its tiny nose and mouth, giving the smallest, gentlest breath she could manage. Too much pressure would damage the fragile lungs, but the kitten needed oxygen. She breathed once, twice, 3 times, then resumed rubbing the small body. "Come on, little one, breathe for me. Breathe." The orange tabby watched intently, its green eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, as if willing the kitten to live through sheer force of attention. Just when Rebecca was beginning to fear the worst, the kitten twitched. Its tiny mouth opened in a silent cry, and then suddenly it was breathing, taking shaky, gasping breaths that gradually became more regular. Relief flooded through Rebecca so intensely that she felt tears prick at her eyes. She had done it. Against all odds, in the most impossible circumstances, she had saved this tiny life. The kitten began to make small, mewing sounds, and Rebecca quickly placed it near the bobcat's belly, guiding it toward a nipple. The exhausted mother lifted her head just enough to sniff her newborn, and then began the instinctive process of licking and cleaning her baby. But Rebecca's work wasn't finished. She could see the bobcat's abdomen still distended, which meant there were more kittens waiting to be born. The mother had used most of her remaining strength on that last contraction, and Rebecca worried that she wouldn't have enough left to deliver the others. She watched anxiously as another contraction came, weaker this time. The bobcat strained, but nothing happened. Rebecca waited through 2 more contractions with no progress and realized she was going to have to intervene again. This time, when she examined the birth canal, she found a second kitten already positioned correctly but simply unable to pass because the mother's contractions had become too weak. This was a different problem, requiring a different solution. Rebecca would need to assist the delivery by applying gentle traction during contractions, essentially helping to pull the kitten out while the mother pushed. It was risky because pulling at the wrong time or with too much force could cause serious injury, but without assistance, this kitten would die inside the birth canal and possibly take the mother with it. Rebecca positioned her hands carefully and waited for the next contraction. When she felt the bobcat's muscles tighten, she applied steady, gentle pressure, pulling the kitten toward her while supporting its body. The bobcat made a low, guttural sound that expressed both pain and effort. "Come on, Mama. Work with me here," Rebecca encouraged. The contraction ended and she released the pressure, waiting for the next one. This dance continued through 4 contractions, each one bringing the kitten a little closer to being born, until finally, on the 5th push, the second kitten emerged into Rebecca's waiting hands. This one was breathing immediately, vigorous and strong, and Rebecca quickly cleared away the membrane and placed it with its sibling at the mother's belly. 2 kittens saved, but how many more were there? Rebecca could still feel movement in the bobcat's abdomen, at least 1 more, and possibly 2. The mother's breathing had become shallow and rapid, signs that she was going into shock from blood loss and exhaustion. Rebecca knew that shock was one of the most dangerous complications of difficult birth, and without medical intervention, it could be fatal even after successful delivery. She needed to keep the bobcat warm and as calm as possible while helping her finish the birthing process. Rebecca took off her outer shirt, leaving her in just a tank top, and draped it over the bobcat's shoulders and back, trying to conserve body heat. The orange tabby seemed to understand and curled up against the bobcat's chest, adding its own warmth to the effort. Rebecca checked her watch and was startled to realize it was nearly 4 in the morning. She had been in this den for over an hour and a half, working to save lives in the darkness while the rest of the world slept on, unaware of the drama playing out in the forest. The next contraction came, stronger than the last few, and Rebecca saw the telltale bulge that indicated another kitten was on its way. This one's position seemed good, and the contraction was effective enough that Rebecca thought the mother might be able to deliver without assistance. She was right. The third kitten slid out smoothly, and the bobcat, finding some hidden reserve of strength, immediately turned and began cleaning this baby herself. Rebecca helped tear away the membrane and was relieved to see this kitten was also breathing well, squirming and mewing as its mother's rough tongue stimulated its circulation. 3 kittens, all alive and breathing. Rebecca felt a surge of triumph that was quickly tempered by concern as she palpated the bobcat's abdomen again. There was at least 1 more, she was certain, but the mother's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her eyes had taken on a glazed quality, and her body temperature felt lower than it should. Rebecca knew she was fighting against time now, racing to get the last kitten or kittens delivered before the mother's body simply gave out from the strain of the prolonged labor and blood loss. She examined the birth canal once more and found what she had feared. The fourth kitten was positioned correctly but seemed larger than its siblings, and the mother's contractions had become so weak they were barely effective. This was going to require significant assistance, and Rebecca worried that the pulling necessary to deliver this kitten might cause damage. But leaving it unborn was not an option. The kitten would die, and the retained fetus would almost certainly lead to infection that would kill the mother as well. Rebecca had no choice but to try, even knowing the risks involved in what she was about to do. She positioned herself as securely as she could in the cramped space of the den and waited for the next contraction. When it came, weak and fluttering, Rebecca applied firm but controlled traction, supporting the kitten's body as she worked to ease it through the birth canal. The bobcat made a sound of distress, and the orange tabby responded by pressing closer and increasing the volume of its purring, as if trying to provide comfort through the vibration and sound. Rebecca maintained steady pressure, not pulling harder despite her instinct to hurry, forcing herself to work slowly and carefully to minimize trauma. The kitten moved incrementally with each contraction, and Rebecca could feel the effort it was taking. Her hands were cramping from the sustained precision work, and her back was screaming from the awkward position, but she didn't dare stop or adjust. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the fourth kitten emerged. It was indeed larger than its siblings, and Rebecca understood immediately why the mother had been unable to deliver it on her own. This baby would have been a difficult birth even under ideal clinical conditions with medical assistance readily available. But this kitten wasn't breathing. It was limp in Rebecca's hands, its body cool to the touch, and she realized with sinking heart that it might have been too long in the birth canal, deprived of oxygen while she worked to extract it. Still, she went through the same resuscitation process she had used on the first kitten, clearing the airway, rubbing vigorously, and administering tiny rescue breaths. She worked for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, willing this baby to respond, to show some sign of life. The orange tabby watched anxiously, occasionally reaching out a paw as if to help, and the exhausted mother bobcat lifted her head weakly to see what was happening with this last baby. Just when Rebecca was about to give up, convinced that this kitten had been lost before she could even free it from the birth canal, she felt the smallest flutter under her fingers. The kitten's chest moved once, then again, and then it was gasping and coughing and finally breathing on its own. Rebecca laughed out loud with relief, a sound that echoed strangely in the dark forest, and quickly positioned this fourth kitten with its siblings at the mother's belly. 4 kittens, all alive, all breathing, all nursing or trying to nurse as their exhausted mother licked them with what little strength she had remaining. Rebecca sat back on her heels and took stock of the situation. The bobcat had delivered 4 healthy kittens against tremendous odds, but the mother herself was in critical condition. Rebecca could see the continued bleeding that indicated potential complications, possibly a retained placenta or uterine damage from the difficult birth. Under normal circumstances, this animal would need fluid therapy, antibiotics, pain management, and close monitoring for at least 24 hours. None of those things were available in a forest den at 4:30 in the morning. Rebecca needed to make a decision, and she needed to make it fast. The logical, by-the-book choice would be to leave now, go back to town, call wildlife services, and let them handle the situation. Wild animals were supposed to remain wild, and human intervention beyond immediate life-saving measures was generally discouraged. But as Rebecca looked at the 4 tiny kittens, so vulnerable and completely dependent on their mother, and then at the bobcat herself, still bleeding and showing signs of shock, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not after everything they had all been through together in this den. The orange tabby had run 2 miles through the night to bring her here because somehow it had known that help was needed. To abandon them now felt like a betrayal of that trust. Rebecca made her decision. She was going to get this bobcat and her babies back to her clinic where she could provide proper medical care. It was going to be complicated, potentially dangerous, and definitely outside the normal protocols, but it was the right thing to do. The question was how to accomplish it. She couldn't carry a full-grown bobcat and 4 kittens through nearly 2 miles of forest trail by herself, even if the bobcat was weak enough to allow handling. She needed help, and she needed equipment, but her phone was dead, and she had no way to contact anyone. The sky was beginning to lighten slightly in the east, the first hints of dawn starting to push back the night. Rebecca figured it was probably close to 5 o'clock, which meant Tom Bradshaw might have seen her text message by now. If he had, he would be organizing a search party, but they would start looking for her at the beginning of the trail, not 2 miles deep into the forest. She was going to have to go back, get help, and return before the bobcat's condition deteriorated further. The problem was leaving the animals alone for the time it would take to fetch assistance. As if reading her mind, the orange Tabby stood up and moved to Rebecca, rubbing against her arm and then walking toward the entrance of the den before looking back at her expectantly. The cat seemed to be suggesting it would lead her back, the same way it had led her here. Rebecca had no idea if the cat would actually serve as a guide on the return journey, but she didn't have any better options. She needed to mark the den somehow so she could find it again quickly, and she needed to do what she could to keep the bobcat stable while she was gone. Rebecca pulled out her flashlight and used it to carefully examine the area around the den, looking for distinctive landmarks. There was a lightning-struck tree about 30 yards to the west, its trunk split and blackened. To the north, a distinctive rock formation that looked almost like a chair. She committed these features to memory and then pulled out her pocket knife to mark the tree nearest the den with a deep slash, creating a visible sign that she could spot from a distance. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. She turned her attention back to the bobcat and did what she could to stabilize the situation. She packed the area around the mother with her shirt and robe, trying to provide warmth and also applying gentle pressure to slow the bleeding. The kittens were all nursing, which was a good sign that they were strong enough to survive if their mother could make it through the next few hours. Rebecca spoke softly to the bobcat, explaining what she was going to do even though she knew the animal couldn't understand her words. "I have to go get help, but I'm coming back. I promise you, I'm coming back with everything I need to save you. You just hold on, Mama, your babies need you." The bobcat's yellow eyes met Rebecca's one more time, and again she saw that flash of understanding, of trust, that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. Then the mother closed her eyes, her breathing shallow but steady, her body curled protectively around her nursing kittens. The orange Tabby had already started down the trail, looking back to make sure Rebecca was following, and she forced herself to stand up despite her aching muscles and the emotional difficulty of leaving. The journey back through the forest was faster than the trip in had been, partly because Rebecca now knew where she was going, and partly because adrenaline was pushing her forward with renewed urgency. The orange Tabby moved swiftly along the trail, occasionally pausing to ensure Rebecca was keeping pace. Dawn was breaking properly now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that filtered through the tree canopy, making the path easier to navigate than it had been by flashlight. Rebecca's mind was already planning what she would need for the rescue operation, running through lists of equipment and supplies, calculating how to safely transport a wild animal in critical condition, along with 4 newborn kittens through rough terrain. They emerged from the forest onto Mountain View Road, just as the sun was clearing the eastern hills, flooding the landscape with morning light. Rebecca could see her house about a mile up the road, and to her immense relief, she could also see Tom Bradshaw's pickup truck parked in her driveway, along with what appeared to be the local animal control vehicle. Her message had gotten through, and help had arrived. She started jogging, ignoring the protests from her exhausted legs, while the orange Tabby kept pace beside her, its mission not yet complete. Tom was standing on her porch with Copper when Rebecca came into view, and his weathered face showed visible relief when he spotted her. Behind him, Rebecca could see Deputy Martinez from Animal Control, and surprisingly, Dr. Stephen Walsh, the veterinarian from the Regional Wildlife Center. Tom must have called in reinforcements when he got her cryptic text message. Rebecca waved to show she was okay and pushed herself to run faster, knowing every minute counted for the bobcat and her kittens waiting in that den. "Rebecca, thank God," Tom called out as she approached, his relief evident in his voice. "Got your message about an hour ago, and we've been gearing up to come looking for you. What in the world is going on? Are you hurt?" Rebecca shook her head, trying to catch her breath as she reached her driveway. "Not hurt, but I need help right now. There's a bobcat in labor about 2 miles into the forest, and I had to assist with the delivery. She's got 4 kittens, but she's in bad shape, bleeding and going into shock. I need equipment to transport them all back here to my clinic." The 3 men exchanged glances that mixed surprise with concern, and Dr. Walsh stepped forward, his professional interest clearly piqued. "You delivered bobcat kittens in the middle of the forest at night, Rebecca. That's incredibly dangerous. Why didn't you come back for help before attempting something like that?" Rebecca gestured to the orange Tabby, which had sat down at her feet and was calmly grooming itself as if this was all perfectly normal. "This cat came to my door at 2 in the morning and led me to the den. By the time I got there and understood the situation, there was no time to come back. The first kitten was breech and malpositioned. If I hadn't corrected it right then, the mother and all the kittens would have died." Tom knelt down and examined the orange Tabby with interest, noting its dusty coat and the determined gleam in its green eyes. "This is a domestic cat. How did it even know where to find a bobcat in labor, let alone think to come get help?" Rebecca shook her head, exhaustion and wonder mixing in her voice. "I have no idea, Tom. I don't even know whose cat this is. I've never seen it before in my life. But somehow it knew that Bobcat needed help, and somehow it knew to come to me specifically." She looked down at the Tabby, which had finished grooming and was now looking up at her expectantly. "It's the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed in my entire career." Dr. Walsh pulled out his phone and began making calls, already shifting into crisis management mode. "All right, we need to treat this as an emergency wildlife rescue. Rebecca, I'm calling my team to bring specialized equipment. We'll need a tranquilizer for the mother, transport carriers that can handle both the adult and the kittens, fluid therapy supplies, and probably antibiotics. Can your clinic handle post-operative care for a wild bobcat?" Rebecca was already heading toward her house, calling back over her shoulder. "It can now. I've got a large recovery room that I usually use for dogs. We can convert it. I'll start gathering what I need from my surgical supplies." Deputy Martinez, a young woman in her late 20s who had been listening intently, spoke up. "I need to call this in to Fish and Wildlife. There are protocols for handling situations like this, permits required for treating endangered or protected species. Bobcats aren't endangered, but they're still regulated." Rebecca paused at her door and turned back, her voice firm but not unkind. "Maria, I understand there are protocols, but that animal is dying right now. We can handle the paperwork after we save her life. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you what's happening. You can report it however you need to, but I'm going back into those woods with or without official approval." Tom put a hand on Deputy Martinez's shoulder before she could respond. "Maria, I've known Rebecca for 15 years. If she says that Bobcat needs immediate help, then that's exactly what it needs. We'll make sure everything is documented properly, but right now we need to focus on the rescue." The deputy hesitated, clearly torn between following protocol and recognizing the urgency of the situation, then nodded. "Okay, but I'm coming with you. This needs to be witnessed by an official representative, and someone needs to make sure nobody gets hurt." Bobcats can be unpredictable, even when they're weak. The next 45 minutes were a flurry of organized chaos as the rescue team assembled. Dr. Walsh's staff arrived with equipment from the Wildlife Center, including a specialized animal transport vehicle equipped with climate control and monitoring equipment. Rebecca gathered supplies from her clinic, including fluid therapy bags, sterile instruments, antibiotics, pain medication, and warming blankets. Tom contributed his expertise in wilderness navigation, plotting the fastest route back to the den and identifying areas where the trail might pose challenges for carrying equipment. Even Copper seemed to understand something important was happening, staying close to Rebecca, but remaining calm despite all the unusual activity. The orange tabby watched everything with those intelligent green eyes, occasionally meowing as if to hurry them along. Rebecca had put out food and water for the cat, but it barely touched either, too focused on the task at hand to be distracted by such mundane concerns. When Rebecca knelt down to examine the cat more closely, checking for any identification or signs of where it might have come from, she noticed something remarkable. The cat's paws were worn and dusty in a way that suggested significant travel over rough terrain, but there were no cuts or injuries. This was an animal accustomed to covering distance, perhaps a semi-feral cat that lived on the edges of human habitation in wild spaces. As the team prepared to head into the forest, Dr. Walsh pulled Rebecca aside for a private word. His expression was serious, but not unkind. "Rebecca, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. Even if we successfully transport this bobcat and her kittens back to your clinic, the mother's prognosis is guarded at best. Postpartum hemorrhage, possible uterine rupture, shock, and the stress of transport could all be fatal factors. You've already performed a minor miracle getting those kittens delivered alive, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that we might not be able to save the mother no matter what we do." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, her jaw set with determination. "I know the risks, Stephen. I know what we're up against. But I've come this far, and I'm not giving up on her now. That bobcat fought through hours of agonizing labor to bring her babies into the world. The least I can do is fight just as hard to give her a chance to raise them." Dr. Walsh studied her face for a moment, then smiled slightly and nodded. "All right then. Let's go save a bobcat." He turned to address the assembled group, his voice taking on the tone of a commander, briefing his troops before a mission. "Everyone listen up. This is going to be physically demanding and potentially dangerous. We're dealing with a wild predator that is injured, frightened, and protecting newborns, which makes her exponentially more dangerous despite her weakened state." Dr. Walsh continued laying out the plan with military precision. "Rebecca will guide us to the location, since she's already been there, and mark the den. When we arrive, I'll administer a tranquilizer dart from a safe distance. We need to give the sedative time to take effect, approximately 10 to 15 minutes, during which we maintain our distance and keep noise to a minimum. Once the mother is safely sedated, Rebecca and I will handle the medical assessment while the rest of you prepare the transport equipment. Tom, you'll be our lookout, watching for any other wildlife that might be drawn to the situation. Maria, you'll document everything for the official report. Any questions?" The orange tabby, as if understanding that the rescue mission was finally underway, stood up and walked purposefully toward the forest trail. Tom chuckled despite the tension of the moment. "I think your guide is ready to go." The group followed the cat into the forest, moving in single file along the narrow trail. Rebecca led the way with the tabby just ahead of her, while the others followed carrying equipment and supplies. The morning sun had fully risen now, flooding the forest with golden light that made the journey far less ominous than Rebecca's midnight trek had been. Birds sang in the canopy above, and the forest seemed peaceful, completely unaware of the drama about to unfold in its depths. As they walked, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the surreal nature of the situation. Just 12 hours ago, she had been sleeping peacefully in her bed, her biggest concern being the emotional toll of helping a family say goodbye to their elderly dog. Now she was leading a rescue team through the forest to save a wild bobcat that had given birth with her assistance, guided by a mysterious domestic cat that had somehow known exactly where to find help. If someone had told her this story, she would have assumed it was exaggerated or entirely fictional. Yet here she was, living it, and the evidence of its reality was all around her in the form of the dedicated team following her through the woods. Tom moved up beside Rebecca as they walked, speaking quietly so as not to disturb the focused silence of the group. "You know, in all my years as a ranger, I saw some pretty incredible things. Watched a mother bear defend her cubs against a mountain lion, saw an eagle take down a deer. But I've never seen anything like what you're describing with this cat and the bobcat." Rebecca glanced down at the orange tabby padding confidently along the trail ahead of them. "Neither have I, Tom. Neither have I. It's like something out of a fairy tale, except it's real and it's happening right now, and I still don't understand any of it." They had been walking for about 30 minutes when Rebecca spotted the lightning-struck tree she had used as a landmark. "We're close," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The den is just ahead, maybe another 100 yards. Dr. Walsh immediately signaled for the group to slow down and move more carefully. He unslung the tranquilizer rifle from his shoulder and began preparing a dart, calculating the dosage based on what Rebecca had told him about the bobcat's size and condition. "This is where it gets tricky," he murmured. "She's already weakened, so I need to use less sedative than normal, but enough to ensure she's safely unconscious. It's a delicate balance." The orange tabby led them directly to the marked tree, then sat down and waited as if its job was complete. Rebecca pointed out the den entrance, and the group positioned themselves strategically around the area while maintaining a safe distance. Through binoculars, Dr. Walsh could see the bobcat still curled around her kittens, exactly as Rebecca had left her. The mother's eyes were closed, and for a heart-stopping moment, Rebecca feared they had arrived too late. Then she saw the subtle rise and fall of the bobcat's chest, and relief flooded through her. The mother was still alive, still fighting. Dr. Walsh raised the tranquilizer rifle, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid startling the animal. At the sound of the safety clicking off, the bobcat's eyes opened, and she raised her head to look directly at the assembled humans. For a moment, her gaze locked with Rebecca's, and again that strange sense of communication passed between them. Then the dart flew, striking the bobcat in the shoulder with a soft thump. The mother flinched but didn't try to flee or attack. Instead, she looked down at her kittens, as if checking to make sure they were safe, before the sedative began to take effect. Her head lowered slowly, her eyes growing heavy, and within 5 minutes she was unconscious. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh approached the den carefully, even knowing the bobcat was sedated. Wild animals could sometimes fight through sedation when protecting their young, and neither of them wanted to take unnecessary risks. But the mother remained still, her breathing deep and regular, as they entered the den and began their assessment. Dr. Walsh's experienced hands moved quickly, checking vital signs and examining the extent of the bleeding. He looked up at Rebecca, his expression grave. "You were right about the hemorrhaging. Looks like a partial uterine tear, possibly from that large kitten you delivered. She needs surgery, and she needs it soon." Rebecca had anticipated this. The bleeding had been too significant to be just normal postpartum discharge. "Can we do it at my clinic? I have a surgical suite, not as sophisticated as yours at the Wildlife Center, but it's equipped for major procedures." Dr. Walsh nodded. "We don't have time to transport her all the way to my facility. Your clinic will have to do. Let's get her stabilized for transport and move quickly." He began setting up a fluid line, inserting the catheter with practiced ease despite the challenging conditions. Tom and Maria, we need that transport carrier now. The team worked with impressive efficiency. Within 20 minutes, they had the mother Bobcat on fluids, wrapped in warming blankets to combat shock, and secured in a specialized transport carrier designed for large predators. The 4 kittens, mewing softly and searching for their mother, were placed in a separate, smaller carrier lined with heated pads to maintain their body temperature. Rebecca held this carrier herself, unwilling to entrust the fragile babies to anyone else. The orange Tabby, having watched the entire operation with apparent approval, stood up and began leading the way back down the trail, as if understanding that its role in this rescue wasn't finished yet. The journey back to Rebecca's property was tense and physically demanding. The carrier holding the mother Bobcat was heavy and awkward to maneuver through the forest trail, requiring Tom and 2 of Dr. Walsh's technicians to carry it, using a specially designed stretcher. Everyone was acutely aware that every jostle and bump could worsen the Bobcat's condition, so they moved with painstaking care, even though speed was essential. Rebecca kept checking on the kittens, monitoring their breathing and body temperature, talking to them softly as they walked. The little ones had begun to show signs of distress, crying for their mother and trying to nurse on each other in confusion. About halfway back to the trailhead, Dr. Walsh called for a brief halt to check the mother's vital signs. His face was tense as he listened to her heartbeat and checked her mucous membranes. "Heart rate is dropping, and her color is getting worse. We need to move faster. The internal bleeding is likely continuing despite the fluids. Rebecca, how much longer to your clinic once we reach the vehicles?" Rebecca calculated quickly in her head. 5 minutes to the vehicles, maybe 10 minutes driving if we push it, then another 5 to get her into the surgical suite. 20 minutes total if everything goes perfectly. Dr. Walsh made a decision. We can't wait 20 minutes. We need to do an emergency intervention right here to slow the bleeding, or she won't survive the transport. Rebecca, I need you to assist me. He was already pulling supplies from his emergency medical pack, setting up for a field procedure that would normally never be attempted outside a sterile surgical environment. Tom, I need you to rig some kind of shelter to give us clean working space. Maria, get on the radio and tell them we need the surgical suite prepped and ready the moment we arrive. This is going to be rough, but it's her only chance. The next 15 minutes were among the most intense of Rebecca's career. Working in a hastily constructed shelter made from emergency blankets stretched between trees with limited light and equipment, she and Dr. Walsh performed emergency hemostasis, using surgical clamps and sutures to control the worst of the internal bleeding. The Bobcat remained sedated throughout, her body completely limp, and Rebecca found herself praying to whatever forces might be listening that this magnificent animal would survive long enough for them to complete proper repairs in a real surgical suite. When Dr. Walsh finally stepped back and stripped off his gloves, his face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes held cautious optimism. That should hold her until we can get her into proper surgery. It's not pretty, and it's definitely not textbook, but it'll keep her alive for the next hour. Let's move. The team needed no further encouragement. They gathered their equipment and resumed the trek out of the forest, moving as quickly as safety would allow. The orange Tabby continued to lead the way, glancing back frequently as if checking on the progress of the rescue operation it had set in motion. When they finally emerged from the forest trail and reached the waiting vehicles, Rebecca felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in hours. The transport vehicle was loaded with care, the Bobcat's carrier secured to prevent shifting during the drive. Rebecca climbed in back with Dr. Walsh to monitor the patient during transport, while one of his technicians took the wheel. Tom followed in his pickup truck with Deputy Martinez and the kittens, and remarkably, the orange Tabby jumped into Tom's truck as if it had every right to be part of the convoy. Nobody questioned it. At this point, the cat had earned its place in whatever was about to happen next. The drive to Rebecca's clinic took 9 minutes, which felt like 9 hours. Dr. Walsh monitored the Bobcat's vital signs continuously, adjusting fluid rates and checking that the emergency repairs were holding. Rebecca found herself staring at the wild cat's face, so peaceful in sedation, and marveling at the journey that had brought them both to this moment. This animal should have died alone in that den, along with her 4 kittens. Instead, through an inexplicable chain of events involving a domestic cat with almost supernatural intuition, here they were racing to save her life with every resource available to modern veterinary medicine. They pulled into the clinic's rear entrance where Rebecca's staff, alerted by Deputy Martinez's radio call, had prepared the surgical suite. The Bobcat was transferred to a wheeled gurney and rushed inside, with Rebecca and Dr. Walsh scrubbing in while the patient was positioned under the surgical lights and connected to monitoring equipment. Rebecca's clinic manager, Patricia, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had seen just about everything in her 30 years of veterinary nursing, took one look at the wild bobcat on the operating table and simply shook her head with an expression that said, this was definitely going into the record books. The surgery that followed was delicate and complex. The uterine tear that Dr. Walsh had partially repaired in the field was worse than they had initially thought, and there was additional damage to surrounding tissues that had likely occurred during the difficult delivery of that oversized 4th kitten. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh worked in tandem, their years of surgical experience allowing them to anticipate each other's moves without excessive communication. Patricia assisted with her usual competence, while another technician monitored anesthesia and vital signs, calling out any concerning changes immediately. 2 hours into the surgery, they encountered a complication. The Bobcat's blood pressure dropped suddenly and her heart rate became irregular. Dr. Walsh didn't hesitate, calling for emergency cardiac medications and increasing fluid resuscitation. Rebecca continued working on the surgical repair, her hands steady even as her heart pounded with fear that they might lose the patient after everything they had been through. The monitors showed the Bobcat's vital signs stabilizing slowly, responding to the medications, and the crisis passed. But it had been close, far too close, and both veterinarians knew they weren't out of danger yet. Outside the surgical suite, Tom Bradshaw sat in Rebecca's waiting room with the carrier of Bobcat kittens on his lap and the orange Tabby curled up in the chair beside him. Deputy Martinez had left to file her report, but had promised to return later to check on the outcome. The kittens were becoming increasingly distressed, crying constantly for their mother, and trying desperately to nurse on anything they could reach. Tom had called Rebecca's staff, and one of the technicians had shown him how to feed the babies using tiny bottles and specially formulated kitten milk replacer. It was slow, awkward work, and Tom's large hands seemed comically oversized for the delicate task, but he persevered with touching determination. The orange Tabby watched the feeding process with apparent interest, occasionally standing up to sniff at the kittens through the carrier mesh. At one point, the cat actually reached a paw through the carrier door and gently touched one of the crying babies, which immediately calmed down and began making small, contented sounds. Tom stared at this display in amazement. "I've been around animals my whole life," he said to Patricia, who had come out to check on the kittens, "but I have never seen anything like this cat. It's like it understands exactly what's happening and what needs to be done. It's the damnedest thing." Patricia, who prided herself on being unflappable, had to admit she was impressed. "In all the years I've worked with Rebecca, we've had some unusual cases. But a domestic cat leading us to a wild bobcat in labor and then staying to see the rescue through? That's going to be a story I tell for the rest of my life." She checked the kitten's condition, noting their strong breathing and healthy appearance despite the trauma of their birth and the separation from their mother. "These little ones are doing remarkably well, all things considered. They're fighters, just like their mama." Back in surgery, Rebecca and Dr. Walsh were finally closing. The repairs had taken nearly 3 hours, but they had successfully addressed all the damage and stopped the internal bleeding. The Bobcat's vital signs had stabilized and were now within acceptable ranges, though she remained critically listed and would require intensive monitoring for at least the next 48 hours. As Rebecca placed the final suture, she felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had been awake for over 24 hours, had performed one of the most challenging deliveries of her career in a dirt den in the middle of the forest, and had just completed major surgery on a wild animal that by all rights should have died hours ago. Dr. Walsh stepped back from the table and pulled off his surgical mask, his face showing the same exhaustion Rebecca felt. "That," he said quietly, "was extraordinary work. I've performed hundreds of surgeries, but I've never been part of anything quite like this." Rebecca looked down at the Bobcat, now breathing easily with the help of the ventilator, her spotted coat rising and falling rhythmically. "She's not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours will tell us whether she's going to make it." Dr. Walsh nodded. "But you've given her a fighting chance, which is more than she had at 2 o'clock this morning. Whatever happens now, you should be proud of what you accomplished today." They transferred the Bobcat to the recovery room, a large space that Rebecca normally used for post-surgical dogs. The room had been transformed for their wild patient, with the windows covered to reduce stress and monitoring equipment positioned to allow observation without constant human presence. The Bobcat was placed on a heated pad to maintain body temperature, with IV fluids continuing and pain medication being administered through the catheter. Rebecca positioned cameras to allow remote monitoring from her office, knowing the less disturbance the animal experienced during recovery, the better her chances of survival. When Rebecca finally emerged from the surgical area, still in her scrubs and with her hair plastered to her head from hours under the surgical cap, she found Tom waiting with the kittens. He stood up immediately, his weathered face showing concern and hope in equal measure. "Well?" Rebecca managed a tired smile. She made it through surgery. All the repairs are done and she's stable for now. But it's going to be touch and go for a while. Tom's face broke into a relieved grin, and he actually hugged Rebecca, careful not to jostle the kitten carrier. "You did it, Rebecca. You actually saved her." Rebecca pulled back and looked at the 4 tiny Bobcat kittens, now sleeping peacefully in their heated carrier after their meal. The hard part is going to be keeping them alive while their mother recovers. They need to nurse every 2 to 3 hours, and they need their mother's care to thrive. If she doesn't make it, we're looking at weeks of intensive hand-rearing with uncertain outcomes. Bottle-raised wild animals often don't develop properly without maternal care. Patricia spoke up from behind the reception desk. "We can set up a rotating schedule for feeding. I'll take the overnight shifts to start with, since you need sleep desperately. Rebecca, you've been going for over 24 hours. You need to rest before you collapse." Rebecca knew Patricia was right, but the thought of leaving the clinic while the Bobcat's condition remained so precarious felt wrong. Still, she couldn't function effectively without rest, and they had a long road ahead. Just as she was about to agree to go home for a few hours, the orange Tabby jumped down from its chair and walked purposefully toward the recovery room door, meowing insistently. Tom raised his eyebrows. "I think your guide cat has another idea." Rebecca followed the Tabby, curious about what it was trying to communicate. The cat sat down directly in front of the recovery room door and looked up at her expectantly. On impulse, Rebecca opened the door just enough to see inside. The Bobcat was still deeply sedated, lying motionless on the heated pad with monitors tracking her vital signs. The orange Tabby slipped through the opening before Rebecca could stop it and walked carefully across the room to where the wildcat lay. Rebecca tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but the Tabby's movements held no threat. Instead, the domestic cat gently touched its nose to the Bobcat's face in the same gesture of comfort it had used in the den, then curled up against the wildcat's side, positioning itself so its body provided warmth without putting pressure on the surgical site. Dr. Walsh, who had come out to see what was happening, stood beside Rebecca and watched this extraordinary display. "That cat," he said softly, "seems to understand more about what this bobcat needs than we do. Look at how it positioned itself to provide comfort and warmth without compromising the surgical area. That's not instinct, that's intelligence." Rebecca nodded slowly, an idea forming in her mind. What if we let the tabby stay with her? It's clearly bonded to the bobcat somehow, and having a familiar presence might reduce her stress when she wakes up. Plus, it could help with the kittens. Dr. Walsh considered this carefully. Unconventional. But then again, everything about this case is unconventional. The tabby has already proven it won't harm the bobcat or the kittens. And stress reduction is crucial for post-surgical recovery. I say we try it. Rebecca made the decision. The orange tabby stays, and when the bobcat is alert enough, we'll try introducing the kittens with the tabby present. Maybe having the cat there will help ease the transition. She instructed her staff to set up a camera with sound monitoring and to alert her immediately if the bobcat showed any signs of distress or if her vital signs changed. Finally, Rebecca allowed herself to be driven home by Tom, who insisted on making sure she actually went to bed instead of staying up worrying about her patients. As they drove through town, Tom spoke thoughtfully. "You know, Rebecca, what happened today is going to spread through this community like wildfire. People are going to have questions, lots of them, about the cat, about the bobcat, about what you did out there in the woods. How are you planning to handle that?" Rebecca leaned her head against the truck window, too tired to think about public relations. "Honestly, Tom, I have no idea. I just did what needed to be done. Everything else can sort itself out later." But Tom had been around small towns long enough to know how these things worked. By tomorrow morning, there's going to be reporters wanting the story, wildlife organizations asking questions, maybe even some criticism from people who think you shouldn't have intervened with a wild animal. Rebecca sighed. "Let them criticize. I saved 4 kittens and gave their mother a fighting chance at life. I'm not going to apologize for that." Tom smiled. "That's the Rebecca Chen I know, but you might want to prepare a statement, something simple that explains what happened without getting into all the complicated details. Tell them the truth in a way they can understand." When Tom dropped her off at her house, Rebecca found she was too wound up to sleep despite her exhaustion. She showered, washing away the dirt and blood and sweat of the long night and morning, then made herself tea and sat on her porch watching the afternoon sun filter through the pine trees. Copper settled at her feet with a contented sigh, happy to have his person back home. Rebecca's mind kept replaying the events of the past 18 hours, trying to make sense of the inexplicable connection between a domestic orange tabby and a wild bobcat that had led to such an extraordinary rescue. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia at the clinic. Bobcat's vital signs remain stable, still sedated but showing signs of beginning to wake. Tabby hasn't left her side. Kittens fed again and doing well. Get some rest, boss. We've got this. Rebecca smiled and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Her team was solid. The patients were as stable as could be expected, and for the moment there was nothing more she could do. She went inside and finally allowed herself to collapse into bed, falling into a deep sleep almost instantly. She woke 6 hours later to her phone ringing. It was Patricia, and Rebecca's heart jumped with fear that something had gone wrong. But Patricia's voice was excited rather than worried. "Rebecca, you need to get down here. The bobcat is awake and alert, and you're not going to believe what's happening." Rebecca was out of bed and pulling on clothes before Patricia finished talking. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Patricia added one more thing before hanging up. "Bring a camera. This is something people are going to want to see to believe." Rebecca made the drive to the clinic in record time, her exhaustion forgotten in her eagerness to see her patient. When she arrived, she found not only her staff but also Dr. Walsh, who had apparently been called back as well. They were all clustered around the monitors outside the recovery room, watching the feed from the cameras inside. Rebecca joined them and felt her breath catch at what she saw on the screen. The Bobcat was indeed awake, lying on her side with the orange Tabby still curled against her. And positioned along her belly, nursing contentedly, were all 4 of her kittens. "How did you get the kittens in there?" Rebecca asked, amazed. Patricia shook her head. "We didn't. The Tabby did. About an hour after you left, the Bobcat started showing signs of waking up. She was getting agitated, probably looking for her babies. The Tabby started meowing at the door, so I opened it a crack to see what it wanted. The cat went right to the kitten carrier, which we'd put just outside the recovery room, and started pawing at it and meowing. So I opened the carrier, and the Tabby carefully picked up each kitten by the scruff one at a time and carried them into the recovery room to their mother." Dr. Walsh pointed at the monitor screen. "Watch this. Keep watching the Tabby." As they watched, one of the kittens finished nursing and started to wander away from its mother. The Bobcat was still too weak to do much about it, but the orange Tabby immediately stood up, gently grasped the wandering kitten in its mouth, and returned it to its mother's side. Then the domestic cat resumed its position against the Bobcat's back, providing warmth and comfort. "It's acting like a co-parent," Rebecca said in amazement. "Like it's helping the Bobcat care for the kittens because she's too weak to do it all herself." Patricia pulled up another clip from earlier. "You need to see this too. When the Bobcat first woke up, she was scared and in pain. She tried to stand up but couldn't. The Tabby went right to her face and started grooming her, licking her ears and cheeks, and the Bobcat actually calmed down. We watched her heart rate drop from dangerously high to normal range just from the Tabby's presence and grooming. I've never seen interspecies bonding like this, especially involving a wild predator." Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. This remarkable orange cat had not only saved the Bobcat's life by fetching help, but was now actively participating in her recovery and helping care for her kittens. The question of where the orange Tabby had come from and why it had bonded so strongly with a wild Bobcat became the subject of intense speculation over the following days. Rebecca put out inquiries through every channel she could think of: animal shelters, lost pet databases, social media posts, but no one came forward to claim the cat. Tom Bradshaw used his contacts in the community to investigate and eventually pieced together a partial story. Several people reported seeing an orange Tabby living semi-ferally in the forest area near where the Bobcat's den was located. The cat had been spotted occasionally over the past 6 months, seemingly healthy but wary of human contact, living on the edges of civilization and wild spaces. One elderly woman who lived at the far edge of town near the forest recalled putting out food for a stray orange cat months ago, but the cat had never let her get close enough to catch or help it. She described how the cat would show up at dusk, eat quickly, and disappear back into the woods. She had assumed it was just another semi-feral cat making its way in the world, nothing particularly remarkable. But now, in light of recent events, she wondered if that cat had perhaps found companionship in an unexpected place, with a young Bobcat who was itself navigating the challenges of wildlife in the forest. Dr. Walsh developed a theory that he shared with Rebecca during one of his daily visits to check on the Bobcat's recovery. "I think what we're seeing is an extraordinary example of interspecies bonding that probably developed over months. The Tabby and the Bobcat likely encountered each other in the forest when the Bobcat was still quite young, possibly recently separated from her own mother. They may have provided companionship for each other, 2 young felines, both making their way alone in the world. When the Bobcat went into labor and got into trouble, the Tabby recognized the distress and used its knowledge of human behaviors to seek help." Rebecca found this theory compelling because it explained not only the Tabby's remarkable actions, but also the Bobcat's unusual tolerance of the domestic cat. Most wild Bobcats would never allow such close contact with another species, but if these two had been companions for months, they would have developed trust and understanding. The orange tabby had essentially become the Bobcat's family, and when family is in trouble, you do whatever it takes to help. It was a beautiful story of connection transcending species boundaries, and it resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. The Bobcat's recovery progressed remarkably well over the following week. Rebecca had named her Sierra, after the Sierra Nevada mountain range, because it seemed appropriate for such a strong and resilient creature. Sierra's surgical site healed cleanly, with no signs of infection, and her strength returned gradually, day by day. The orange tabby, which Rebecca had named Rusty for his burnt orange coat, never left Sierra's side except for brief bathroom breaks and meals. He groomed her regularly, helped manage the increasingly active kittens, and even seemed to alert the clinic staff when Sierra was showing signs of discomfort that required pain medication. The 4 kittens thrived under their mother's care and Rusty's assistance. Rebecca had named them based on their distinctive markings. Spot had an unusually large rosette on his shoulder, Stripe had a linear marking across her face, Shadow was the darkest of the 4, and Bright had the lightest coloring with pale golden eyes. They were all strong and healthy, growing rapidly and beginning to show the playful behaviors typical of young felines. Watching them tumble over each other, while Rusty and Sierra looked on with what could only be described as parental patience, was one of the most heartwarming things Rebecca had ever witnessed. As word spread about the rescue, the clinic became inundated with media requests. National news outlets wanted the story, wildlife documentaries wanted footage, and animal welfare organizations wanted to use the case to promote wildlife conservation. Rebecca tried to manage the attention while prioritizing her patients' well-being, but it was overwhelming. Finally, with Dr. Walsh's help, she organized a single press conference where she could tell the story once and answer questions, hoping that would satisfy the public interest without turning her clinic into a constant circus. The day of the press conference, Rebecca stood before a room packed with reporters, cameras, and curious locals. She had prepared a statement, but when the moment came, she found herself speaking from the heart instead. What happened here started with one cat's incredible act of compassion and intelligence. Rusty somehow understood that his friend was in mortal danger, and he knew that humans had the ability to help. He ran 2 miles through the night to find me specifically, led me through the forest to Sierra, and then stayed to help care for her and her kittens through recovery. This story reminds us that animals are capable of far more complex thoughts and emotions than we often give them credit for. The questions that followed ranged from practical to philosophical. Would Sierra be released back to the wild? What would happen to Rusty? Were the kittens healthy? How had Rebecca managed to perform such complex procedures in emergency conditions? Rebecca answered each query as honestly as she could, acknowledging both the medical challenges and the ethical questions the case raised. When one reporter asked if she had any regrets about intervening in a wild animal situation, Rebecca's response was immediate and firm. My only regret would have been if I had turned away when help was needed. These animals showed courage and trust, and the least I could do was honor that with every skill I possess. The press conference ended with photographs of Sierra and her family, taken from respectful distances that wouldn't disturb them. The images that resulted captured something magical, a wild bobcat recovering from surgery with her 4 healthy kittens and an orange domestic cat curled protectively around them all. Those photographs went viral within hours, spreading across social media platforms and appearing in newspapers around the world. People were touched by the story, by the evidence that compassion and connection could bridge even the most unlikely divides. In the weeks following the press conference, donations poured into Rebecca's clinic from people moved by Sierra's story. Some sent money to help cover the cost of her care, while others donated supplies and equipment. A few veterinary pharmaceutical companies even reached out to offer experimental medications and therapies that might aid in Sierra's continued recovery. The outpouring of support was overwhelming and deeply touching, confirming Rebecca's belief that people fundamentally wanted to help when they saw need. They just needed to be shown how. Dr. Walsh visited regularly to monitor Sierra's progress and consult on her eventual release plan. The question of when and how to return Sierra to the wild was complex. She had recovered physically from her ordeal, but she now had 4 dependent kittens who would need several more months of maternal care before they could survive independently. Additionally, there was the unprecedented situation with Rusty. The bond between the Bobcat and the Tabby showed no signs of weakening, and separating them seemed cruel after everything they had been through together. Yet keeping a wild Bobcat in captivity long-term wasn't ideal either. After much discussion and consultation with wildlife experts, a plan began to take shape. They would create a large outdoor enclosure on Rebecca's property, something substantial enough to allow Sierra and her kittens to exhibit natural behaviors while still providing protection and medical monitoring during the kittens' vulnerable early months. Once the kittens were old enough, they would all be soft-released back into the wild at a carefully selected location far from human habitation. As for Rusty, the decision would be left to the cat himself. If he chose to go with Sierra into the wild, they would support that choice. If he preferred to remain with humans, Rebecca would adopt him officially. The construction of the enclosure became a community project. Local contractors donated materials and labor, while Tom Bradshaw used his expertise to design a space that would provide both security and enrichment. The result was impressive, a quarter-acre enclosure with multiple levels, climbing structures, hiding places, and even a small stream. It was equipped with cameras for monitoring and had a secure attachment to Rebecca's clinic building that would allow the cats to move between indoors and outdoors as they chose. When it was completed, Sierra and her family were moved into their new home. Watching Sierra explore the enclosure with her kittens for the first time was profoundly moving for everyone involved. The Bobcat moved with increasing confidence, her surgical scars hidden beneath her thick fur, while her kittens tumbled after her with boundless energy. Rusty followed the family at a slight distance, always watchful, always ready to herd a wandering kitten back to safety or groom Sierra when she settled down to rest. The dynamic between them was fascinating to observe, with Sierra clearly the dominant personality, but Rusty filling a crucial supportive role that seemed to reduce her stress and help manage the rambunctious youngsters. As the months passed, the kittens grew rapidly, developing the skills they would need for independent life in the wild. Sierra taught them to hunt, using live prey that Dr. Walsh's team provided, starting with mice and working up to rabbits. She showed them how to climb, how to hide, how to read the wind and move silently through underbrush. The kittens were quick learners, their instincts awakening under their mother's patient instruction. Rusty participated in these lessons in his own way, often demonstrating patience and stealth that the kittens seemed to learn from, even though his techniques were those of a domestic cat rather than a wild predator. Rebecca documented everything, not for publicity, but for science. The unprecedented situation provided unique insights into Bobcat maternal behavior, kitten development, and interspecies relationships. Dr. Walsh collaborated with her on a research paper that would eventually be published in a prestigious wildlife journal, contributing valuable knowledge to the field of wildlife rehabilitation and behavioral biology. But beyond the scientific value, watching this unlikely family thrive brought Rebecca a sense of fulfillment that reminded her why she had become a veterinarian in the first place. By the time autumn arrived, painting the forest in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the kittens were 6 months old and nearly ready for release. They had grown into healthy young bobcats, each with their own personality, but all showing the strength and skills necessary for wild survival. Sierra's health remained excellent, with no lasting effects from her traumatic labor and surgery. The time had come to begin the soft release process, gradually reducing human contact and allowing the cats to spend more time in the wild sections of Rebecca's property before the final release into their chosen habitat. Dr. Walsh had selected a remote area of national forest as the release site, a location with ample prey, good cover, and minimal human activity. The plan was to transport Sierra and her kittens there in stages, first establishing a temporary enclosure at the site where they could acclimate, then opening that enclosure to allow them to disperse naturally when they were ready. It was the gold standard for wildlife release, giving the animals the best possible chance at successful reintegration into the wild. The question of what Rusty would do remained unanswered, and Rebecca had resigned herself to letting the cat make his own choice when the time came. The morning of the first transport arrived cool and clear, perfect weather for the 3-hour drive to the release site. Sierra and her kittens were carefully loaded into transport carriers designed to minimize stress, while Rusty watched from his perch near the enclosure entrance. Rebecca had expected the orange tabby to want to come along to stay with his adopted family to the very end, but instead, Rusty jumped down and walked purposefully to Rebecca's house, sitting down on her porch as if to make his intentions clear. He had fulfilled his role as guardian and helper, but his place was here, with humans, not in the deep wilderness. Rebecca felt her throat tighten with emotion as she looked at the remarkable cat who had started this entire extraordinary journey. "You've earned your retirement, Rusty," she said quietly, bending down to stroke his orange fur. "You saved them all, and now it's time for you to have a real home." As if in agreement, Rusty purred loudly and rubbed against her legs. That settled it. Rusty would stay with Rebecca, becoming a permanent member of her household alongside Copper and her other rescue cats. He had proven himself worthy of comfort and safety, and Rebecca was honored to provide it. The release process went smoothly over the following weeks. Sierra adapted quickly to the temporary enclosure in the forest, and her kittens explored their expanded territory with enthusiasm. Cameras set up around the site captured footage of the family hunting successfully, establishing den sites, and gradually spending less time in the enclosure and more time in the surrounding wilderness. Finally, 3 weeks after their arrival, Sierra and her kittens stopped returning to the enclosure altogether. They had made the transition to wild independence, exactly as hoped. Dr. Walsh continued monitoring the area through trail cameras for months afterward, and the images they captured told a story of success. Sierra was spotted regularly, healthy and confident in her territory. The kittens, now adolescents, had dispersed to establish their own ranges, as was natural for young bobcats. Spot was seen hunting successfully in a rocky area 5 miles from the release site. Stripe appeared to have claimed territory near a creek system rich with prey. Shadow and Bright were spotted together occasionally, suggesting they might maintain some sibling bond before eventually separating completely. All 4 showed every sign of thriving in their wild existence. Back in Redwood Valley, life slowly returned to normal, though Rebecca's clinic had been forever changed by the events of that extraordinary night. The donations received allowed her to expand her facilities and take on more complex cases. She established a wildlife rehabilitation program in partnership with Dr. Walsh's center, training other veterinarians in emergency procedures for wild animals. The story of Sierra, Rusty, and the Midnight Rescue became part of local legend, told and retold in the community as an example of what could be accomplished when compassion and expertise combined with a little help from an extraordinary orange cat. Rusty settled into domestic life with surprising ease for a cat who had spent months living semi-ferally. He got along well with Rebecca's other animals and seemed content to spend his days lounging in sunny spots and his evenings curled up on Rebecca's lap. But sometimes, particularly at dusk, Rebecca would find him sitting at the window facing the forest. staring out at the darkening trees with an expression that might have been memory or longing. On those occasions, she would sit beside him and stroke his fur, quietly thanking him for the gift he had given her, the reminder that the boundaries between wild and domestic, between species and individuals, were far more permeable than anyone imagined. 1 year after the rescue, Rebecca stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Rusty sat beside her, purring contentedly, while Copper dozed at their feet. In the distance, she could see the enclosure where Sierra had recovered and raised her kittens, now empty, but maintained as a reminder of what had transpired there. Rebecca thought about the Bobcat and her offspring, thriving somewhere in the vast wilderness, living the lives they were meant to live. She thought about the impossible chain of events that had brought them all together, and the lesson she had learned about trusting instinct, taking risks, and recognizing that sometimes the most profound connections arose from the most unlikely circumstances. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Walsh. Just got photos from the trail cameras. Sierra has a new litter. 2 healthy kittens spotted with her yesterday. She's doing great. Rebecca smiled and looked down at Rusty, who was staring out at the forest with those knowing green eyes. Did you hear that? Your friend is a mother again. Rusty purred louder and rubbed his head against her hand. Rebecca laughed softly and scratched behind his ears, marveling at the mystery of this cat who had somehow known exactly what to do on that desperate midnight when a friend needed help. Some bonds transcended explanation, defied logic, and reminded us all that the world was far more magical than we allowed ourselves to believe. This was one of those bonds, and Rebecca felt privileged to have been part of its story.